said you wanted to learn more about where your great grandparents might come from. So I'm going to walk through a handful of PowerPoint slides. This is available. I'm sending you the PDF version of this. So if you'd like to see your family tree, go ahead and click on the link down there and we'll walk through it that way. Also, get a hold of me if you have any questions. I don't know how much of what I'm about to say is completely true because, this is just a little hobby. And who knows what's actually really true and available on the web. There are some people who've done interesting things with your family tree, and I found a bunch of articles. So let's begin with the big tree, going out to your great great grandparents. We know a few of them, especially on your mother's side, um, not so much on your father's side. So let's begin with your father's side and up on your namesake with David Freeman, although sometimes it looks like it was spelled Frumerman. And where did he come from and what's his background? We know that he had a brother and that his brother, Ischil, I have no idea how to pronounce these names, came to the Boston area before he did. So David came first, and David was married to Ida, and we don't know a whole lot about Ida. I'll go through that in a moment. We believe that David came from Korets, Ukraine. Um, we certainly know that all of David's children were born in and emigrated from Korets, Ukraine. And we believe that his wife Ida was there as well. All right, so there's David and Ida and all the kids that made it to the United States and really did some remarkable things. You'll see there's Joseph, your grandfather, and Mary, your grandmother. Ida is listed twice in the local, address lists for living in Lynn, but there's no evidence that she actually ever made it over here. She's listed as David's spouse, but there's no independent record that she ever came in. And most likely she died before the family came over. David was born in 1868 he listed Russia, but we now know roughly where that was. He married Ida in 1890, and they had 5 children over 10 years. Now, David dies in 1928 in Lynn. He came to the United States on the ship Philadelphia in July of 1905. And here's a postcard, not from him, but that was written about that particular vessel at the time. On the right side of the screen, I'll list the children, spouses and children. In the 1910 census, your great-grandfather was living on Blossom Street in Lynn, and he was working as a glazier. So this was what his profession was from when he came to the United States and when he retired. He installed and repaired windows. Most of the years in Lynn, he was living on Shepherd Street. Not all, but they moved from place to place. And he was often living with some combination of his children and his sons-in-law. And we know that he was very active in the Jewish community throughout Lynn. This is the only picture I was able to find on the web of your great-grandfather. He's, again, very active throughout this period. He was at the dedication of a Hebrew school in Lynn. And he was still listed as employed, living in 1925 on 36 Whiting Street. And he dies in 1928 in Lynn at the age of 65. And while we, again, don't know exactly where David Freeman becomes Freeman was born, we do know that his 5 children were born in Korets, Ukraine. You can click on that link, it'll take you there a little bit. Here, for example, is the Declaration of Intent to Become a Citizen from Jacob, and that lists Korets. We also know that when Lena came over, she listed Korets as her hometown where she was born. This is Korets. It was a major center of Hasidism, and it, of course, like so many of the Ukrainian Jewish communities, was destroyed ultimately in World War II. But the pogroms in the late 1800s made it almost unlivable. There was a large fire there, and that was the world that your great-grandfather was escaping from. Again, we know very little about Chida, or Ida, except that she also seems to have come from Korets. So Joseph, your grandfather, was born in Korets, Ukraine. What about your grandmother's family? Her parents were Hyman and Rebecca. And Hyman comes over and establishes himself as a barber. And looks like, hey, he also had a successful, somewhat hard-scrabbled, successful career. Mary Siegel was the oldest child and oldest daughter of Hyman and Rebecca. Hyman was born in Vilnius, although it's important to notice that when someone says when it's reported they were born in Vilnius, it's often conflated with the region or the area around Vilnius. He married Rebecca Walensky, and he died in Revere in 1949 at the age of 73. He arrived here in August of 1891. He had family here also from Vilnius. One of his brothers was a butcher, and he, of course, was a bartender. I'm sorry, a barber. They were living on Spring Street, listed there again as a barber. There are multiple spellings for Siegel throughout this period. S-E-G-A-L, Segal, S-E-G-A-L-L. And we also know that at one point he was spelling his own name, S-I-G-A-L. Here in 1906, he's living on Poplar Street, which is in current Roslindale. Even though when he was living there, he was commuting into Boston to work as a barber. And then they move out to Ocean Ave in Revere, and later on to Thornton Street in Revere. But while there was still commuting into Boston to work at the barber shop that he'd spent his career at. This is so close to the shore. This is where they were living. And he was widowed and then dies ultimately in 1949 in Revere. Rebecca, his wife, died when they were much, much younger. She dies in 1924. So the children were still relatively young. I mean, Betty was born in 1905. We don't know how she died. We just know that she died at a relatively young age. Hyman never remarried, and most of the family members sort of stayed in the home with him, including some of the sons-in-laws and so forth. So, your great-grandmother, Rebecca, some records have her spelling quite different, but Rebecca shows up in the census in 1910. We see her again in the census in 1920. She's taking care of this large family. In 1920, you'll also notice in that census that Joseph and Mary are living with Mary's family, Mary's parents. Then she dies in August of 1924. I couldn't find any records about how she died or any pictures of her. So if we just look at this part of the family, and so we're looking at the Freeman side and the Siegel side, see that the Siegel side is coming from Lithuania, presumably Vilnius, and the Freeman side is coming from Korets, Ukraine. What about your mother's side of the family? This gets kind of interesting. I'll begin with your grandfather, Isaac. And as you know, the Ginsburg part of your family is the great furniture part. And the furniture business runs all the way through your great great grandparents. Because everybody in the family seems in one way or another to have been involved in the furniture business. Um, let's take very quickly a look at the great great grandparents. So Jacob and Minnie both came from Lithuania. And then Hyman and Anna also came from Lithuania. They died ultimately in Des Moines, where their children and grandchildren were. And they, like everybody else, were involved in the furniture business. So this part of the family is coming from Lithuania. We'll look at specific cities in a moment. But I want to tell you, you probably know most of this already about Lazarus Ginsburg. Really quite a story. Very entrepreneurial. I'm showing Lazarus's brother Cassell and sister Sarah, mainly because we're going to talk about Cassell. Now, Mary also had brothers and sisters. I'm not listing them here, but Cassell will come into the story again in just a moment. Um, Lazarus and Mary have these four children, all sons. The third son, of course, is your father, Isaac. So, Lazarus Ginsburg is born in 1862 in Pivliskaya, Lithuania. He marries Mary Lena Davidson in Des Moines. They didn't seem to know each other before they came to Des Moines. They had four children. He died on October 5th of 1925 in Davenport. Remember, they lived in Des Moines, but he dies in Davenport. These are the four kids: Harry, Saul, Isaac, and Herman, who is generally known as Babe. This is Pivliskaya, Lithuania, and it was a very small town, and also predictably decimated, first from pogroms and then ultimately in World War II. So Lazarus, who was known as Louis, was incredibly entrepreneurial, very creative, and seems to have been someone who could drive a very hard bargain. He arrives in the United States in 1882, gets married in 1885 in Des Moines, and in 1888 opened up the Ginsburg Furniture Store. This was done with the help of Mary Davidson's parents and siblings, who were also in the furniture business. And Lewis's brother, Cassell, also opens up a furniture store. So they're all kind of friendly competitors. But what Lewis did that distinguished his store from all others at the time is that he came up with an installment plan for financing furniture. And he was quite serious about running it almost like a bank. And it allowed for middle class and lower middle class to buy a house full of furniture on loan, on installment. And again, he was the innovator in that area. Here's an advertisement just to give you a sense. They advertised like crazy. Al Ginsberg's great store, and it begins to grow like crazy. Ultimately, the Ginsberg furniture empire spreads to several states. They're in such strong position in the 1930s during the Great Depression. They buy up other furniture stores throughout the Midwest. And for a brief period, Ginsberg Furniture Store was the largest in the Midwest outside of Chicago. Here's an 1899 ad. Again, they're advertising all the time. This one shows a little steamroller in which he's rolling over the competition because of their prices and quality. Um, Louis Ginsberg was also very involved in the Jewish community and was a major benefactor. There's a building now named in his honor in Des Moines. And in this article in 1906 talks about him bidding up the opportunity to lay the foundation for a new building. And he bid it up very aggressively till all the other bidders were out of contention. Here's a 1908 full page ad for Reliable Furniture Stores, what it was called at the time. Just wonderful to go through all of these ads. And if you hop on to the Ancestry page, you'll find in there, maybe a dozen ads that I've downloaded. This is a really interesting photo. It's from a picnic. It ran at the end in September, but the picnic happened in the summer of 1922. And these are some of the employees at Ginsberg Furniture. So your great grandparents, Lazarus/Lewis Ginsberg and Mary Davidson, are right there. Brother Cassell is over here, and he has his own furniture store at that time. And then remember that they had four sons, and three of them are in this picture. Harry was the oldest, and Harry basically takes over the business. Saul was next oldest. He helps out, was for quite some time treasurer and helped to run it. Isaac, your grandfather, very involved. The person who's missing in this photo is Herman, also known as Babe. And we'll get a feel for him in just a moment. The youngest and least disciplined of the children. That picture was in 1922, but in 1909, Lazarus/Lewis had a suicide attempt while on a train outside of Chicago. And they called it a nervous condition, but apparently this had happened a few times. He'd been up and down. It seems like he might have been bipolar based on the descriptions in the newspapers. And they say he would just go into a moment where he would just lose his mind and a great depression at that moment to do something dangerous. In this case, he locked himself in the bathroom of the train and slit his own throat. A doctor on the train saved his life. And your great-grandmother was predictably beside herself. This is Mary. I don't think he ever really recovered from that. And in 1911, your father would have been 17 years old. And that's when he was given power of attorney over Lazarus, who didn't die, survived. The company then, the furniture store, although Lazarus Lewis is still around, is really being run by Harry, Saul, and then ultimately by Isaac. But power of attorney at the age of 17 went to Isaac. Here's some more just fabulous ads. That's their 25th anniversary. 1916, their new, tall, amazing building. that was in 1916. You should have seen within 20 years they'd built out much more on both sides of that building. Here in 1925 is a story about the 40th anniversary, wedding anniversary of Mary and Lazarus and the different people who were there, including Mrs. Frank Gottstein, we'll know about in just a moment. In October of 1925, Lazarus kills himself, successful in a suicide attempt. The newspapers in Davenport reported that it was a suicide attempt. The newspapers, suicide. The newspapers back in Des Moines, where he was from, talked about it might have been an accident. The coroner's certificate of death that was done just a few hours after he killed himself by jumping out of a window at the Black Hawk Hotel reported immediately that it was a suicide. Then another tragedy befalls the family. Cassell died of a heart attack after hearing about his brother's suicide. So less than a day later, and these two great men were gone. So that's the end, but there's so much of that business that continues on. It's just a remarkable story, and I have plenty of articles about the Ginsburg furniture business. What about Mary? All right, so Mary was born also in Lithuania, but in a different town, Kalvaria. I have no idea how to pronounce that. In Lithuania. Here's where it is. And you can click there and find out also about the history of the Jewish community. It was a very, very Jewish community. Over 80% of the population in 1856 was Jewish. The pogroms were successful in expelling many of them, and they came to the United States in the 1880s. Here in 1910, you see a story in the Des Moines paper about their 25th wedding anniversary. And most of the time when Mary shows up, this is your maternal great-grandmother, when she shows up in the newspapers, it's because she's had an interesting party at her home or she's been working in the Jewish community. She was a philanthropist. She was clearly well-liked and well-loved in the Jewish community. There's an open house that she's having at her home. And there's another part of the story coming out of her husband's suicide that we should talk about. That is that he was a wonderful benefactor to many people, but there was one person he left out of his will. Lazarus gave no money to his fourth and final child, Babe Ginsburg. He said he wouldn't get anything until he had been married. But Babe was clearly not the marrying type when he was young and got into a lot of trouble. We know after Lazarus's death that Babe lives with his mother and is brought more and more into the family business. But he was definitely a bit of the problem child. There's 1914, he's arrested as a peeping Tom. Turns out to have been apparently quite credible. 1922, he's arrested for posing as a cop. He was charged, ultimately arrested for attacking a waitress in a diner. And not being married, he was cut out of the will. But the family still took care of him. The brothers had him working at the store. He lived with his mother and helped to take care of his mother after the father's death. Your great-grandmother dies in 1933 in a real tragic way. She and her good friend, Gertrude Gottstein, um, had been in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and then leaving Hot Springs to come home, they were swept away in a flash flood. The the person who was driving was Herman or Babe. You'll see here Mrs. Ginsburg's son, who was driving the car. Then he opened the door and swam to safety, but he was unable to rescue either woman. It appears that this was an avoidable accident, and he should not have tried to drive through the river along this little concrete bridge. And it was really quite tragic. There's a bit more of the story here, but a real cruel twist is that Gertrude Gottstein was Harry's wife's mother. So she was in the family. And now Babe had been partially responsible, certainly present at the death of both his own mother and of Harry's wife's mother, Harry's mother-in-law. It's tragic. Okay, so we see a bit more of where the Ginsburg and the Davidson clan came from. So now we have 2 from Ukraine and 4 people from Lithuania. We'll take a closer look over on Rachel Miller's side of all of this. This is your maternal grandmother. And let's look at Louis and Fanny, your maternal great-grandparents. Louis Miller is another fascinating character. He's also born in Lithuania. And he married Fanny Goldish in the region of Vilnius. They had 8 children over 13 years. And he dies in Duluth in 1925 at the age of 60. Look at all of these children. It's amazing. And Louis Miller sometimes it looks like kind of a tough life. This is from the Minnesota Census, Duluth, Minnesota, 1895. And you have the Goldish family, so your great grandmother, her family, and you have the Miller family. They're all living right next door to each other. And you'll notice that Louis Miller is listed as a peddler. I got to read a little bit about what it meant to have been a peddler back then. And while Louis Goldish may have begun as a peddler and died as a peddler, boy, did he made the most of it in some very interesting ways. Fanny, who was living next to her parents when they were just married, freshly married to Louis, was also born in Lithuania. And again, they had 8 children in 13 years. So we know from the census in Minnesota in 1895, and then the federal census in 1900, that Louis Goldish was a peddler. I have a little clipping here from the Duluth, Minnesota newspapers, 1903. There's an awful lot about peddlers and how they were trying to control the business of peddlers because they kept undercutting the prices of brick and mortar stores. It appears that Louis Miller was primarily at the beginning a fruit peddler, and he was getting the fruit from his wife's family. So they were bringing in fruit, and then he was peddling them. And this is a picture of a fruit peddler in Kenosha, Wisconsin. You'll see right here. Now, what he's doing is he's also known as a drayman. The type of wagon was a dray, and so people who were delivering goods off the back of a dray were called draymen. In 1910 census, Louis is listed as a drayman. And then in 1917 and 1920, he's listed as a Teamster drayman. And that's a really important moment because your great grandfather was involved in the unionization of draymen in Duluth, Minnesota. He was a major player in that movement. Um, and he also was somebody who chafed at the idea or even the phrase peddler. He wanted to be known as, and the union movement wanted to be known as, um, mobile merchandisers, which is fabulous. So when he's working as a Teamster drayman, he's working out of this dray line, merchant's dray line, and then taking material from the city to all kinds of smaller businesses or to homes. And it was sort of the predecessor to Uber or Uber Eats when people needed somebody to deliver that material somewhere. He dies in 1925, but the family had maintained a really wonderful home. The family shows up time and again and sort of making a small addition or an attachment under the garage. They lived at 1708 Jefferson Street, just see how close they were to Lake Superior. And they show up in the newspaper quite a bit, especially around World War One. Ben Miller was something of a war hero, and there were two Miller brothers that fought in the war. So that's Lewis, your great grandfather, dies again, 1925. What about Fanny? Fanny Goldish also comes from Lithuania, sort of in the Vilnius area. And just now, remember, her husband dies in 1925, but to give you a feel for what this family was like, what the home was like, the upward mobility felt like, these are members of the family living there at 1708 Jefferson in the 1930 census. And while she's not employed, while Fanny's not employed, could you have among her children the manager of an electrical store, two co-proprietors of a music store, a pharmacist in a drugstore, a clerk for the county treasurer. So they were a very upwardly mobile, hardworking family that began as peddlers from rural Vilnius region in Lithuania. Fanny Goldish was um, one of the children uh, of Esther and Shmuel Goldish, and they're from Lithuania. And the her siblings were also just really interesting characters. And I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole just reading about your great grandmother's siblings. They're really interesting. There's also somebody who has a fair amount of material up on Ancestry.com, Elia Romberg, and I have no idea. I don't know anything about this person, but just wonderful material. And it becomes clear that both of the Goldish line comes from this small town in Lithuania that I have no ability to pronounce, but you can go to these places as well. So there's your great grandmother. I'll just highlight three of the siblings. This is David Goldish, who was known as Burko, Burl Dov Goldish. Um, Nickname was Burko, nicknamed after his grandfather, Burko Goldish. And David Goldish was a peddler and a fruit peddler. And so, along with your great grandfather, his brother-in-law was very much in the peddler business and in making it a respectable profession. He was also the oldest of the Goldish children. Um, probably the most influential in the Jewish community was A.M. Goldish. And, he became quite a significant figure in the Jewish community in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and was very socially active and socially conscious, but shows up in the newspapers probably most notoriously in a lawsuit that was about his brother because Louis Goldish was married to somebody who AM didn't approve of, and the marriage ended fairly quickly. But then his first wife, Lewis's first wife, sues the brother um, for turning her husband against her and actually won that lawsuit and was sort of notorious. Louis Goldage then moves to Marietta, Ohio, and um, was in the scrap metal business. Later, AM also moves to Marietta, Ohio, and they were very, very financially successful in the scrap metal business. And that takes us, of course, to the child of Isaac and Rachel, and those are your parents, um, and your siblings, and then back to your big family tree. I think we can be pretty clear about where people came from. Most of your family, most of your great grandparents are from Lithuania. I don't know exactly where Lewis Miller came from in Lithuania, but I think we've nailed down the hometowns of your 8 great grandparents and the home country of Lewis. So that's where you're from. That's where you're from. And I know I've talked a little bit long, but I want you to know I really enjoy doing this. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll send you whatever I can give you. Thanks.